Yes, you absolutely can cope with the COVID era. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I want to talk about the struggles of the enormous epoch change that is facing everyday life, and specifically how to manage in this uncertain world. So right now across the world, we are living through unprecedented times. Global pandemic, total shift in balances of power across the world, economic collapse, uncertain malaise, rise of extreme ideologies on both left and right, political instability, and so on. This is a very difficult time to plan ahead. A sense of helplessness can be quite prevalent in individual life, and certainly for too many people around the world. This year is so much worse for them in terms of everyday life, economic prosperity and well-being than at any time previously. A lot of people are out of work, often for the first time. Much of their investments, life savings, housing, all of that is now very unstable. And of course, the connections that we have with one another, our ability to travel across boundaries and across global communities in a cosmopolitan way has been significantly undermined. And in this space, there is a lot of thought that, the mental health issues, the increase in violence, that these things could be as bad as the disease itself, if not worse. And, I don't want to, evangelize anything in this podcast, but I do think that there is a philosophical technique that is incredibly useful for this particular age and uniquely suited as a tool that people can use to manage in this acutely difficult environment. And I'm talking about Stoic philosophy. And so, I love the English language. I think it's incredibly expressive, has so many words. You have various different creative ways to get different ideas across. But one area in which we have been fantastically ill-served is in the realm of Stoicism, okay? Because in English, Stoic means to describe a particular set of behaviors that is often associated with Stoic philosophy, i.e. not expressing much emotion, not reacting to things, being very kind of unengaged emotionally, distant, perhaps even avoidant when it comes to expressing particular feelings and sentiments. And that is not the doctrine at all, right? It's a description of how people perceived Stoics. And you can do this with other forms of Greek philosophy as well, like cynicism. To call someone a cynic, right, in the parlance of the English language doesn't describe the doctrine of cynicism as it was to the ancient Greeks. So I'm going to try and correct some of that. I'm not going to go into the origin so much of the philosophy or talk about some of the most profound philosophers for which there are practitioners of tremendous ability and nobility. But I will leave a link in the description below towards a lecture that really does go into this in a great sense in terms of the epistemology of the doctrine. What I will focus on is just specifically what it is and how to practically use it as a tool for managing these difficult times. So first of all, Stoicism teaches that you can divide everything in the universe into two categories. Things that are within your control and things that are outside of your control. And when you start to do up the list, there's a lot of things outside your control. You don't control the weather. You don't control other people's perceptions. You don't control, what's happening in other countries. You don't control the progression of the disease. You don't control, whether or not you're made redundant or not in an environment where the economy as a whole is in malaise. There are so many things in your life that you are at the behest of forces extraneous to yourself that have profound impact on you and your family. You don't control if the train arrives on time. You don't control, who sits next to you on the bus, right? There are just so many things in your just day-to-day life that happen to you, okay? But there are also things that you can control. You can control your intentions. You can control your actions. You can control your motivations. You can control how you behave towards other people. You can control your manners. You can control whether you choose to act on certain stimuli or not, right? And that is what Stoicism teaches as its first principle, that what you should do is focus on those things that you can control and not worry about anything else, right? Be aware, obviously, that there are things that you can't control, but be mindful of the fact that that doesn't say anything about you personally, right? If you're on a ship and it sinks and you're stuck in a lifeboat, well, that has nothing to do with who you are as a person, okay? If you get sick, that doesn't necessarily change who you are, right? And it shouldn't do that. And so the second precept of Stoicism is to live in accordance with nature. Now, this is another area where the language has sort of butchered the philosophy, but this time more a product of how words change over time, their meanings and translation. So the way that the ancient Stoics talk about nature isn't the way that we would perceive it. So we might say living in accordance with nature is like living out in the forest somewhere, in an eco-friendly kind of sustainable environment, being connected with sort of the natural world, so to speak. For the Stoics, it's almost exactly the opposite of that. I'm going to paint a picture for you. Imagine you've had a wonderful night's sleep and you wake up, you feel slowly refreshed, you have a wonderful meal that's healthy but also tasty, filling but not overfilling. You go have a warm shower, you feel fantastic and relaxed, you sit down, you do some tasks, you feel quite productive but not rushed, and then you're in your element, right? That's what the Stoics refer to as living in accordance with nature. And then imagine something bad happens in that space, right? You're in that perfect space and then you get some really bad news on the phone, okay? Well, how do you think you're going to react in that environment versus if, you got off on the wrong side of the bed, you didn't get much sleep, you missed the bus, you look down, you had a stain on your shirt, all of these things going wrong, and then you get a call that says some really bad news. Now, which space would you rather receive that bad news in, okay? And that's what they mean by living in accordance with nature. You have a natural self where if all the dials align, you are in your most even-tempered but positive mindset. And if you get bad news in that environment or a negative stimuli, you can react to it in accordance with your most natural processes. You're not rage to anger. You're not on the Tinder box where you're overwhelmed with stress and you snap at someone. You actually process that in your best way and think about how you'll meet that challenge, using the rational, most virtuous parts of your being. And what Stoicism teaches through various techniques is to, instead of just having everything perfect all of the time that allows you to do that, to broaden the spectrum of circumstances in which you are actually in your natural state and therefore able to most appropriately react to things and problems as they arise. So I'll talk to some of those techniques in a bit. Another precept of Stoicism is that life is suffering, right? And this is one of the things where people just kind of worry about Stoicism a bit. They see them as a bit morbid, okay? And I used to have that problem as well. I'd read the works of Stoics and be like, oh, okay, these guys are very depressing. But actually they're not. They're not. It was a misread on my part. What Stoics teach is that people are born, terrible things happen to them, and they die, right? Most of life is misery, okay? Interrupted briefly by fleeting moments of dopamine-induced, euphoria, right? But by and large, we are built to endure. Okay, but what's astonishing is that we do. We're actually incredibly successful at that. Okay, that we tend to do all the vicissitudes of human life, sickness, misfortune, disappointment, failure, and yet we still manage to push on and get through. It's not the story isn't, why do people suffer, but why do people, manage to challenge adversity so successfully, broadly speaking, across time, particularly in ages that were, far worse than what we are experiencing today. So what's the antidote to that? Well, not the antidote, but how do you manage that? Well, the first technique is to imagine all the worst things that can happen to you, right? And to really try and live that experience. So let's say you're about to get on a long-haul flight, okay? Now, COVID era, difficult to do often, but imagine that's the case. Imagine being stuck at the airport, being caught up in some random security check that goes wrong. Imagine the flight being delayed by 3.5 hours when you're next to some, screaming children. Imagine being stuck on the flight, next to someone who's constantly complaining about the seats and, pushing their elbows to the side. Just imagine all of those things ahead of time. And in the context of the COVID era, imagine losing your job, imagine losing your house, imagine, a family having, serious problems, imagine, your relatives being, getting sick. Spend the time living through that. Now, it might seem like a really unpleasant experience, but one of the things that makes people cope is that when they're aware of it, when they're not surprised by it, when it happens, it just it is much more easy to wash over it. And what Stoics at the more advanced levels are taught is what you should really spend a lot of time is imagining having a terrible death, right? Because you're going to die, okay? Everyone is going to die. And what makes them seem morbid is the fact that they spend a lot of time thinking, often daily about, having a horrible chronic illness that eventually is terminal, because what that awareness, that expectation of suffering, means that when it happens, you're already quite well girded to it occurring. Then how do you deal with it? What's the approach to deal with it? Well, another precept of Stoicism is virtue. The way to live your life is virtuously, and there are some Stoic kind of Roman virtues that they sort of put forward for that. But what it really means is, let's say you're of high status and you have a lot of power and you lose everything. You have a terrible accident, it causes you, a mobility injury, and you can't then work and you lose your job, and you lose everything. Well, what have you really lost? Okay. The important thing with Stoicism is to not lose any more than itself, i.e., don't be tied up in status. Don't be tied up in your job. What makes you a full human being is your intrinsic virtue, and that brings you back to those things that you can and can't control. The things that you can control, your intentions, your actions, your motivations, how you treat other people. If you can assume the burden of maintaining the same courtesy towards others that you would have in your most even-tempered, perfect environment as you would in an environment where you have nothing, then you are living according to Stoic virtue. And therefore you shouldn't actually ascribe you should be very quick to criticize yourself, but you should be very slow to criticize others. If someone else criticizes you for something, well, either they're mistaken, in which case there's no problem, or they're correct, in which case you should be grateful for the fact that it gives you an opportunity to work on your Stoic virtue. So there's a lot of self-improvement. Stoics are often encouraged to sleep rough few days a year, to get a sense of okay, if you did lose everything, how much do you really need in order to survive? And you'll be amazed at how little a human being actually requires to live virtuously. A famous quote from the prequels of the Star Wars trilogy from Yoda is lifted straight from Stoicism. It's the fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And this comes to the sort of Stoic approach to emotion and why people see them as being like kind of unemotive. Well, that's not true. Stoics are trained to live and love well, appropriately, not in ways that damage, right? It's very easy to love in a harmful way, okay? So, for example, the emotion that they spend probably the most time developing historically, and I credit a lot of this to Seneca, would be the emotion of anger. So the Aristotelians would say that anger is like a righteous emotion. It gives you a feeling of injustice that motivates you to act on that, right? And the Stoics reject this. The Stoics say that anger, like all emotion, gives you information, which you should react to in accordance with nature. So a simple question they would ask is, when have you acted on anger in a way that was most positive, right? What anger does is it tells you that something is wrong. It's an information input, okay? And it does give you a certain energy. And so Stoics just accept that as a natural form of perception. It's like seeing something or hearing something, right? It's not something telling you to act, okay? What it's telling you is you have to think about this and understand why you're experiencing that emotion, or in the case of other vicissitudes, why you're experiencing trauma, why you're experiencing guilt, why you're experiencing grief. These things are negative emotions that can cause real harm if directed in the wrong way, but nevertheless can help you think through what's going on and then react in accordance with nature, your best virtue. And that's why we have, independent judges, for example, that they may experience a degree of anger, but their separation from whatever it is that they're ruling over gives them a perspective to administer appropriate justice. In ways that are supposed to minimize harm, even to perpetrators, if it's for the common good. I've talked a bit, just to recap about Stoicism. Stoicism divides everything into things you can control and things you can't control. And if you are personally aware of those two things, then things don't become catastrophized. They become simple matters of what happens in life, right? And you can have preferences. You prefer to be healthy, you prefer to be wealthy, but you're not tied up in it. Your sense of self well-being and the way you interrelate with others doesn't need to be tied to those things, particularly if they're beyond your control. Then, the sense of how to live. Well, you want to live virtuously. You want to live in accordance with nature. Nature is defined as your best self, your most relaxed well-being. And how do you maximize the time in which you are in that state? Well, you do that by imagining all of the things that could go wrong and being mentally prepared for that. So hopefully all that's a sort of a summary of now, I'm not a Stoic philosopher. I'm an imperfect practitioner at best, and I'm developing all the time. But I will leave links in the description that I really thoroughly recommend. There's actually one on Marcus Aurelius, one of them. I can't even begin to describe. He's a Roman emperor, but a Stoic practitioner. And I'll just give you one quote, not from him, but from Abraham Lincoln, which is, almost anyone can handle adversity, but if you really want to test a man's character, give him power. And Marcus Aurelius had unlimited power across everyone in the world for 19 years, and I strongly recommend a lecture on how he handled that through Stoicism. So I'll leave it at that. If you found value in this conversation, please do like and subscribe. It helps YouTube know that the channel is giving people value. And if you have any comments on Stoicism or other ways in which you would found useful for dealing with the troubles that are in this present age, please leave them in the comments below. We'll discuss them in the week in review, and see you next time. Thank you.